There was nothing else they could do but throw their heads back and shout, "Help! Help! Help!" they cried. Then they yelled it again for good measure. They were in urgent need of it. In a few moments the rock cake beneath their feet would sink, and they'd be submerged in hot, sticky marmalade. Walter and Fritz started to panic. Clara looked desperately around for something that could help them, but there wasn't anything at all. With a sudden, dangerous lurch, the rock cake they were standing on started to sink even faster. Together, they all started shouting again, "Help! Help! Help!" Then, to their surprise, someone answered them. There was a rumbling clatter, and their voice, which seemed vaguely familiar, cried, "Don't worry, we'll save you." Before Clara, Fritz and Walter could even think who it might be, there was a loud noise. It oddly sounded like a vehicle working upstream. Then there was a small explosion and the rumbling began again, this time accompanied by crunching of snow. "What's happening?" squeaked Fritz in a tiny mouse voice. The next second the light from the moon was momentarily blocked by something flying right in front of it. The three travellers looked up and saw traction in the air. It looked strangely like a cheese carriage that the Mouse King was driving earlier. In fact, it was the cheese carriage that the Mouse King had been driving. The machine splash-landed right into the middle of the Marmalade River, and out hopped Humphrey, squeaked Fritz. And there was a Humphrey Walnut clambering out onto the bonnet of the cheese vehicle. The cracker wheels crumbled immediately into the hot, sticky goo, but the rest of the large machine sat on top of the surface, melting very slowly with a hiss. There was someone else with Humphrey behind the steering wheel, but Humphrey's enormous fluffy tail was blocking them from view. What on earth was Humphrey doing here? Wondered Clara, but then decided she would think about that later. At that moment the important thing was to get off the sinking rock cake. Hot, sticky orange goo was already spitting at her slippers. "I've come to rescue you all!" cried Humphrey, beaming. He took his tree-climbing rope off his shoulder and began swinging it above his head. He hit himself in the face with it 3 times and almost knocked himself off the cheese carriage. But on the 4th go, success! It looped above him like a lasso, then whoosh! He gave it a flick. The hook at the end of the rope sailed through the sky, and then with a gigantic crunch, he gripped onto the edge of the cliff above him. Clara, Fritz and Walter all cheered as Humphrey quickly climbed up to safety before positioning himself over the edge and reaching back over towards them. "Come on," he cried encouragingly. "I'll help you, quick!" There really wasn't a single second to lose. The marmalade was glugging and hissing all around them and creeping ever closer to their feet. Clara helped Fritz up the rope and watched as he climbed towards Humphrey's outstretched paws. Fritz's long tail trembled and his big mousy ears lay flat to his head with worry. "Super climbing, Fritz!" shouted Clara encouragingly. "You're doing really well." It was a long way up the cliff, but once her brother had got a good lead, Clara began her climb. Behind her, Walter clambered with shaking, nervous hands. "Don't look down," said Clara. But there was no fear of that. Walter had his eyes firmly squeezed shut. After a few minutes, all adventurers had scrambled to safety. Even Walter, who stood up with his quivering legs. "I did it," he said. Then he said it again more excitingly. "I did it!" "You did," said Clara. "We all did. Thank you, Humphrey." Beside her, Fritz did a little dance of joy. "Hooray!" he cried. But Clara realised with horror He was too close to the edge, and his slippers began to slide on the snow. Time seemed to slow down as Clara, Humphrey and Walter saw Fritz teeter this way and at the edge of the cliff. His arms and tail windmilled around and around and as he tried to catch his balance. "No!" shouted Clara. She stretched out her hands to pull him to safety, but he was just out of reach. Fritz looked at her with wild, worried eyes as he lost his footing entirely. His legs and bottom flew up in the air and he started to fall backwards. Then, just as Clara thought that all hope was lost, a hand, or was it a paw, reached out from over the side of the cliff and pushed him back to safety. Fritz stumbled across the ground, straight into Clara. She, in turn, tumbled into Humphrey, who fell backwards into water, and then they all landed in the snow with a flump. For a minute there was just quiet. Then they all started to laugh. "We're safe!" cried Clara. "We were almost turned into marmalade, but we're safe!" And they laid back, catching their breath and feeling quite giddy with relief. But who saved Fritz? Clara was sure that she'd seen a tiny grey paw. She sat up to look towards the riverbank, but before she was distracted by a loud sound of crunching footsteps on the snow-covered mountain behind her. A large dark shadow fell over her, and Fritz and Walter and Humphrey, and from their position on the ground, they found themselves unexpectedly looking up into a row of very stern faces.